morning to all of you who are joining us. I know we have lots and lots of people who have registered for this, and so we are excited to welcome you and to let you know that this is definitely a time where we are all questioning lots of things and trying to figure things out. And so we have assembled some of the top minds, so to speak, in our district, some pastors and leaders that are they're men and women who are thinking forward in a lot of ways and have lots of creative ideas. My name is Jason Allison. I am the Director of Church Strengthening for Converge MidAtlantic, and I am certainly glad that you joined us. I will let the panelists introduce themselves in just a minute, but before we do that, I wanted to give you just an idea as to what's going to happen over the next 60 minutes or so. We are going to be asking the panel some questions and giving them some chance to respond. And hopefully you will be able to hear what they're saying and you will understand stuff and your brain will be challenged in some ways. You will be challenged to think about things maybe you haven't thought about. Maybe it will confirm some things and encourage you. Whatever it is, that's the goal, that these panelists will be able to help you as you start thinking, how do we move forward together? The next few weeks and months are going to be definitely new waters for a lot of us. I don't know of anyone who's traveled through this kind of time. And so we are all making this up as we go. And yet when we do it together, we are definitely better together in the process. Occasionally, you're going to see a poll pop up on the side of your screen. And these are, you will only have like 60 seconds to take the poll. It's one question with multiple choice. And it's just to kind of give us an idea maybe as to where you are in this process so that hopefully we can address things that may come up for you. One other thing that I want you to know, if you have a question at the end of 60 minutes or so, we're going to leave time for a Q&A time with the panel. If you have a question that you want to pose to the panel, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. That will make sure that the panelists and I see the questions so that we can then give them over to the panelists at the end. I'll try to, if we have different questions, but they're kind of around the same theme, I may have to lump them together. But we want to make sure that if you have questions, even if we can't answer them, we can point you in the direction of resources that will help you. So that's the plan. We have assembled a top-notch team of people. And before I turn it over to Dr. Bruce Hopler, who is the Executive Director of Church Strengthening for Converge Worldwide, I thought I'd just take a second and give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves. I don't know what order they are on everyone's screen, so I'll just call a name, and you can let them know your name, what church you're at, and maybe like what type of church you have, whether it's a multicultural or a multi-site or small or big city, suburban, whatever it may be, just so that our attendees have an idea as to what they're getting into, and when you start speaking they have a context, and also what city you're located in or near, so they understand that as well. I'll start with the person on my screen, at least, is Derek Sanford. You're up first. If you could just give those 3-4 quick things, I appreciate it.
Sure. Hey, welcome everybody. My name is Derek Sanford. I'm the pastor at Grace Church. We're a multi-site church right around Erie, Pennsylvania, and we have 3 locations. Our biggest location is about 1,100 people, and then about 450, and then about 150. So we have 3 sites, and great to be with everybody today.
Great. Thank you, Derek. Dan Nold is the next one on my list here. Dan?
Great to be with you all. I'm the pastor at Calvary Church in State College. We're also a multi-site church, and kind of similar in the sense that we have a bigger site in Boalsburg, kind of in the State College area, and then 4 other sites spread around Central PA.
Thank you. All right, Charles Whitaker, you are up next, my friend.
Hey, this is Charles Whitaker. Good to be with everybody today. I'm so thankful for the Lord. Our church is River of Life Church that I pastor. Started the church over almost 20 years ago. But we're excited. We're in Temple Hills, Maryland, right outside of D.C. John Jenkins First Baptist Church is like 20 minutes away. which is the smallest church anywhere on the planet. But in any case, we're doing great. Thanks for being part of this today. And hopefully we all could add something that could give us some wisdom as we walk through these challenging times.
Great. Pastor Nathaniel Yates, you're up next.
How you doing? I'm glad to be here. I pastor Bethany Community Church. We are a multi-generational, multi-ethnic, and multicultural community. We average about 200 total on a Sunday. And I'm glad to be a part of this panel to discuss what we have on the slate today.
All right. Emily Manders, you are up next.
Hi, it's good to be with everyone today. I am Executive Director at Restoration Church. We are located just north of Philadelphia, technically a suburb. We are a neighborhood church. We are about a 6.5-year-old church plant, and we average about 325 on a Sunday. But the neighborhood is our community that we really reach. So that's us.
Rob Patterson.
Everyone, it's great to be with you. I'm Rob Patterson. I'm the pastor of New Hope Community Church in Loudonville, Ohio, which is a tiny town kind of between Columbus and Cleveland, Ohio. And we are a medium-sized church in a very small town. And we, throughout our history, almost a 20-year history now, have been a multi-site church, and I really think of us more just as a multiplication center. We just want to multiply the kingdom, and so we've started churches and campuses that have become autonomous churches, and we continue to do that.
All right. Well, before I hand it over to Bruce, I'm going to say a quick prayer, and then Bruce, I will hand it to you to dive into our panel discussion. So if you don't mind, let's just pray together. God, we ask your blessing on this time. May it encourage us. May it challenge us. May it stretch us. It's obviously strange doing this through a webinar. This is new ground for a lot of us. But in the same breath, God, you have given us so much in the gifts of technology that we can reach so many people. I pray you would spur us on, and that we would spur one another on to good works, to glorify you and to build your kingdom. We invite you now in Jesus' name. Amen. Dr. Bruce, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jason. Hey, everybody. It's an honor to be here. I don't tell the other 10 districts this. I am biased. You're one of my favorites. It's partly because I grew up in your district. I was founding pastor for 18 years in your district. And as well as I just believe your region from Philly on up down to Charlottesville, North Carolina, all the way over throughout Ohio, one of the most influential regions of our country, and you are the ones ministering to them. So it's an honor to be here. If you haven't met your district exec, Brian, he truly is a rock star. It's been exciting to see what he has been doing in your district. And Jason, you just met him. He is your brand new church strengthening director. He's a part of our national team that I've created. I've got to know him a lot in the last 6 months, and you guys are really blessed there. So yes, let's dive in. We got a lot of great questions to ask. I am going to start this time with Pastor Dan Nold there near State College. Now, if you don't know, Pastor Dan is not only has experience like all of you, but he had a little more experience than some of you in that he actually was hospitalized over the COVID-19. So Pastor Dan, let me start with you. This season has been fluid with input and possibilities and information and just been all over the map as everybody's been trying to figure out. What have been some of the stable principles guiding you to make your decisions?
Well, first of all, I wasn't hospitalized. I was sick for about 2 weeks. They say that if you're not hospitalized, it's a mild case, but it was probably the sickest mild I think I've ever experienced. But doing well now. You know, like you said, Bruce, man, everything is so fluid. The only thing that's kind of constant is everything is changing. And I think at the same time, I think all of us kind of experience this sense that there are decisions being made out there that we have no control over that kind of shape what we do. And so that for me has kind of been one of the first, guiding principles, is to realize that, I'm not in control of many of the things that I need to, kind of take into context of making decisions. And I just think that's been part of the lesson that God wants to teach all of us, is we're not nearly as much in control as we usually think we are. But a couple of the key principle guidelines for me, and these will probably change after the webinar today, but the first is that I don't think this is a temporary time, it's a transitional time. And those two things are different. If it's a temporary time, the primary goal is to get out as quickly as possible, get back to normal as quickly as possible. If it's a transitional time, then the primary goal is to get into it rather than get out of it, get into it as deeply as God needs us to be, so that he can do everything that he wants to do to prepare us for the next chapter. Times of transition are times of incredible catalytic growth, and we ought not to leave it until we've gained everything from it that God wants us to gain. So if it's transitional, my hope is to go forward, not go back to normal. A second one is don't forget the vision. God has given each of us congregations and the kingdom of vision. So don't forget the vision in the midst of trying to figure out the now, but hold the vision loosely. Times of transition are times when God often gives us new paradigms. So look for the wave. Doug Slaybaugh said that times of crisis tend to catalyze trends, not change the direction of them. Some of those trends are going to be negative, some are positive. If it's a negative wave, get ready to dive under. If it's a positive wave, let's catch it. But hold the vision loosely and look for the new paradigms that God's given us. A third one comes from a quote that I came across from Alan Hirsch, who said that when he learned how to play chess, his chess master told him to lose your queen in the first two moves, and then learn how to play the game without the queen. And when you learn how to play the game without the queen, you really learn how to play chess. And then he went on to say, this is what's happened to the church right now, is we've lost the queen. The queen has been taken off the board. And I just think, we're so stinking quick to try to get the queen back on the board and the way the queen always was. And the queen is, weekend worship is huge. It's critical. It's important. But I think we need to be careful about trying to get it on too quickly. I think Jesus is far more interested right now in how we scatter. I think Jesus has pushed us out of the buildings. I think he's far more interested in how we scatter than in how we gather. And the gatherings are going to come back. But I don't want to miss what he's doing in the scattering. I think if there is a revival in the coming days, it's going to be a neighborhood revival. And so that's what I'm trying to figure out. The fourth one is that relationships matter now more than ever. It's not all virtual. We're never, at Calvary at least, we're never going to go back to the same digital footprint that we had before this, but in-person relationships matter. We need to do everything we can to continue to foster that. But for us, that's going to be in the context of honoring the authorities over us. That's just a decision we're making. It's not a political decision. I feel like it's a biblical decision. We're going to follow the Pennsylvania, for us, yellow phase guidelines until we can justify that they're causing us to sin, until we can justify that it's causing us to diminish the glory of Christ. I don't think a mask is going to make my singing better. I don't think it's going to diminish the glory of Christ. So that's kind of the principles right now as we're kind of moving into pivoting into what's ahead, that I'm trying to keep in mind as I try to make decisions.
Wow, thank you, Pastor Dan. I hope you guys are taking notes. And remember, this is being recorded, so you better watch it again later. And remember, as Jason mentioned, there's a Q&A button. We will answer questions there at the end. Now I want to go southeast, Pastor Dan, into the heart of DC, or at least inside the DC Beltway anyway, there in Maryland. Pastor Charles, let me ask you, what kind of strategy will you employ for seating, masks, gloves, sanitizers, all of these things, facility airflow, cleaning, all of these different types of dynamic during the testing, or even the COVID testing if possible? What are some of your plans in that regard?
Well, I think the big thing here is, it's like what Dan said, this thing is so fluid. It's hard to tell when you're going to do what. But I think the biggest thing that we've started this discussion for our team is to look at strategy whenever it is going to happen. So one of the things we started thinking about in our team is, matter of fact, we're putting together a comprehensive team to come up with even creative, more practical ways to make sure that we are ready whenever that is. Number one is that we thought about instantly, hey, let's get thermometers, right? The kind that the digital, we've ordered those because I know that at some point everybody's going to be ordering them. So we wanted to make sure we got ahead of that. We have to think about everything from when people walk, whenever this day happens, which is obviously, I'll come back to that later, but strategies from when people come through that parking lot to signage up. If you're not feeling well today, we'll ask that you go back home and pray that you'll be better, making sure everybody feels protected, increasing hand sanitizer. We've been talking to our vendor that takes care of our stuff called Centos. They have a whole new disinfectant service that they provide. So how are we going to do that when people leave? We talk about seating. I was just on a conference call, maybe some of you on the webinar with Ed Stetzer, talking about seating plan. How are you going to change seating from side to side, front to back? We even talked about the idea of how are you going to have people exit or enter the building from how, if you're doing communion, how are you going to do communion now? You can't, you don't want to pass it out. Some people do communions with the little wafer and juice in a packet. And how are you going to do that in the future? Even from offerings. I know some people have people drop off offerings in a bucket or some basket or something. That's going to be probably the new normal how we do that versus passing the bucket. To even airflow in the building. This is a huge concern right now, even as people know about flying and traveling on an airplane. That's the whole key. How do we have our facility have the proper type of airflow so that things are not stagnant and so on? So that's running heating systems or AC systems. Just taking a real gamut at that. And, again, mask, how service going to look with the mask. And I love what Dan says, my praise and worship is not going to get probably any better with a mask or without a mask, but I will still be able to give God praise. So we got to take a look at that, all the disinfected things. I think also there's going to be a look, and everyone has to think through this a little bit about how long do you want service to be? Some people's services are 60, 70, 80 minutes, whatever. We probably would try to keep ours at 50 to 60 minutes. And depending on how the plans roll out for each phase, whether it's 50 people, then it goes to 100 people, just how are you going to do that and making sure you can go through. I think many of us may be forced to look at how we do multiple services now because we only can probably get a limited number of people in whenever this occurs. So these are some of the things that we're thinking through. There's a list, and I'm on the phone constantly. This is probably another good point to help pastors get with other pastors in your area because everything is very area focused and strategic. And I'm on a committee with other pastors in the Temple Hills area, and we're already talking through strategies, and we're helping each other. So we're building a list. We continue to build that list. We glean off each other's ideas and so on. But for sure, for us, we want to make sure we follow whatever the local state is telling us what to do, not just what the politics are saying, because we really care about lives. And of course, in the African-American community, with the disparity being so great of people dying in the African-American community versus and people of color and poor, we really have to be extremely, extremely careful and make sure that people feel safe.
Thank you, Pastor. Okay, moving a few miles north, but staying in the fine state of Maryland, Pastor Nate. What considerations do you believe need to be made to face a new norm of the post-COVID-19?
Indeed. In listening to some of what Pastor Dan and Charles said, a lot of those kind of filter in. One thing I would say right away is we need to take a hard look at our methods without losing our mission. So that's how we kind of look at that. When we talk about how we do communion, not just the wafers, whether it's handing out bread or the prepackaged, but also how it's disseminated. A lot of times we pass trays or we pass buckets for offering. This Corona situation has caused us largely to move quickly into online giving platforms. So we have contactless there. We may want to look at fixed boxes in the back for those who aren't comfortable when they come in. For communion, we may want to look at stations where people can get communion, or even consider what we've learned in this situation. Maybe we do continue to extend a virtual communion that's in addition to our normal services, which will eliminate that possible contact. We need to consider all of our methods, not just whether we're wearing masks in praise and worship, But for some congregations, they use choirs, or we use a bunch of people on the stage. Do we want to limit the amount of people on the stage at a given point and spread them out? So we really need to look at our methodologies, not losing our discipleship efforts. We need to be more intentional about them. Security measures. When you have a lot of people that you may see coming back into your facilities, and we're considering, offsetting services, maybe one on a Saturday versus one on a Sunday, when you can't see faces, what does your security presence look like? How do you be secure and yet have the people feel safe? Have we considered things that we should have considered, and some of us may have missed early with our children? When we went strictly online, a lot of children's ministries kind of got pushed to the side, and then they've gradually been catching up. Well, when we return, we also need to consider, how do we handle our children? Because social distancing toddlers is nearly impossible. They run right together. So do we stagger in our children's ministry in a way that is still ministering to their needs while also trying to keep them safe? So as we think about all of the considerations for sanitizers and cleaning, are we cleaning between services, or are we spreading our services out a bit? What have we learned? I agree with Pastor Noel when he says, don't be in such a rush to get out that you leave the lessons behind. There are some things that we have learned that we need to consider. How do our budgets look? Where are we prioritizing things? Those sacred cows that we look at, and I'm not saying that it's the things that have to go away, but we've learned, or should have learned, that there are things that we just always did. And then there are things that we trimmed it down, because what we were here to do was to take the gospel to those who don't have a relationship with Christ, and to edify and build up those who already do. And some of the things, while they're good trappings and they're good aesthetics, we found out we really didn't need them as much to do our main mission. And so I think that when we look at that question of what do we need to consider, we largely have to consider, what do we bring back with us from a technology standpoint? What do we continue to use some virtual platforms for? What have we learned about our streams? Are they still just primarily an observation from outside, or are we going to adjust in a way that gives those who have now joined our congregations, because that's another thing, we have a body of people who we couldn't reach physically before, that have now joined in on our worship services online, that will still be there when we go back into our facilities, because they might not be even in the same location we're in. And have we considered what that looks like? Where right now we're talking kind of face to face, it's an audience of one over 90 times. Whereas when we go back into our facilities, we're really talking to the people in the room. How do we incorporate some of the lessons, not just get, as Pastor Noel kind of alluded to, not be in a rush to get back to what was our normal, but consider, what does the new normal look like? What have we learned that will allow us to take the gospel even further? And have we determined that as we go back, we consider every one of those needs? One last thing that I want to give here is that we have to get the mindset that I hope we've been transitioning into, that evangelism cannot be, hey, why don't you come to church with me on Sunday? I remember as a kid, we would hand out tracts and invite people to church. Well, now every member has to take on the mantra that you are the church. So when you're in proximity with someone, or someone has a relationship with you and your family, are you a witness in those cycles? Because otherwise what we're going to have is you can't default to come to my building. You can't default to, hey, we're all going to come together. You have to default to the gospel, which means you have to have it in yourself.
Thank you, Pastor Nate. Okay, let's say east, but go north into the suburbs of Philly. Executive Director Emily, not only a director of her home church, but also on staff there of your fine district. So what gains has your church, or you as a leader, experienced in this season? And how will you continue to capitalize on them as you're planning for reopening your church?
Thanks, Bruce. And thanks everyone who's been sharing. I'm like taking notes. I don't know if you guys are, but I really appreciate all that you're sharing. I think at Restoration, one major thing that we've navigated that I know many perhaps small to medium churches have been navigating is the shift from, we had just barely started live streaming our services. and not very well, if I'm being honest. But we now have an online church. Okay, so that's even a big difference from streaming on live. Like whether you had a live stream set up, we had live stream, but now we have church online. And as we're considering how to maintain our online church presence, right, different than just a live stream presence, that's a really big question for us as we consider reopening. How do we keep our online church engaged? Because our online community, we are tracking and we see they're beyond our zip code, right? And they may still continue to come. They're becoming a part of us. So we're asking ourselves questions also along those lines of how do we get our online church community to become participants in a local church ministry when they may not live in our local area, but how do we encourage them to participate and also not only be just attending online, right? Like a fly on the wall. So those are some big questions, but it's a huge gain for us to have an online church developing, but it becomes a whole new project to figure out how to lead forward. When and if we will be gathering in person again, right, everybody? How are we going to continue to do that well? This is something before COVID-19 at Restoration, we were in the beginning stages of considering how to add another service, another in-person gathering. Because of COVID-19, we've added a whole nother community online. So figuring out how to cultivate that well and minister to that online community is a big thing for us. Also, another gain I think that we have had is that as a staff, a lot of our weekly tasks have been put on pause. So a lot of us have needed to rewire and perhaps take on new roles. And that's been really encouraging to see our staff rise up to do that. But we've gained time to think strategically about how to not waste this crisis. And I know you guys have all heard that phrase, how are you not going to waste this crisis? So we've been able to evaluate areas, I think kind of like Pastor Nate was sharing, things that maybe are done forever, and may, or consider also things that will be new in the future. And it's been helpful to have time away from the weekly, Sunday's always coming, away from that driving rhythm to really pause and evaluate ministry and strategy. And I think two areas that we know that we need to clarify are continuing that online community, but then also our discipleship pathway. We are seeing that we need to really hone in on how to get people into groups. And the question then becomes, how do you start that when maybe they've never met in person before, right? So if we're bringing people into online groups, so there's some big questions we're looking at. The last gain that I will say is that we really have been hearing our people miss gathering. And I don't know about you guys, but it's encouraging to hear that, because you're used to kind of getting that weekly feedback and the weekly interaction with your community. It's been really helpful and encouraging to hear how much our community loves each other and desires to be together. But like Pastor Nate was saying, one big thing that we're hearing people miss a lot is our kids ministry. And I feel like we could make a whole nother Zoom meeting about how to do that. So I'm not going to go into that, but I'm just going to say that is really an area that we are prayerfully considering how we do that, because it feels like they will need to meet last in all these phases that could be rolling out. But there's ways to do things online. We know it's not the same. And we know that our kids matter and that they help disciple their parents a lot. So that's definitely something we're missing, but it's a gain in that we know that our people really value it. So we're trying to figure out how to lead forward in that. So.
Well, thank you, Emily. And by the way, that was a little intro also. She didn't know this, but that Q&A button, if you want to ask more about how to do children's ministry online, she can go into it if you asked a question on the Q&A button. Okay, now let's go west in your district, in the fine state of Ohio. So Pastor Rob, you are a church that is oozing with money. No, you've said, hey, you're in a smaller town area, and so that had been some time of financial struggle. So what are some of the key steps that are helping you weather the season financially?
That's great. Although, Bruce, just to be honest, my mind's gotten a little stuck when Pastor Charles mentioned that he was going to 60-minute or less gatherings likely. I wondered, are they just going to do no music? Because that's like all preaching time, right, Charles? Anyway, you could.
It could be. Yes, it could be. It'll be very dynamic. That's how it would be.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd say, we were lucky in that we'd sort of been cultivating a culture of generosity, even though we can live in a smaller area, a more rural area. We certainly don't have, a ton of high paying jobs in our community or immediate region. And so, yeah, finances has always been a challenge. And so we have, high costs, but a lot of people, whose capacity is smaller. And so we had just in January, right before this, done a series, and had been, I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, we'd done kind of one-off messages, but it had been years since we'd done a whole giving series. And man, God's timing was all over that, because people's faithfulness did increase, and it's continued through this. And I think too, my experience has been that, people have been less distracted by all sorts of other things as they've been staying at home more. And so it's been easier to be responsive and focus on, you don't forget about giving when your list of things to do has shortened. But a couple things that to me seemed pretty obvious, but as I've talked to different pastors, and met with different pastors virtually, this seems to be like a huge issue. People's giving is plummeting, and this has already been mentioned, but man, there are so many ways for people to give that so many churches just haven't really taken the time to take advantage of. And so just like for most of us, maybe live streaming wasn't something we had been doing. This time has forced us to do that and to figure out how to do it well. And that's certainly, even as a pretty techie church, that's been something that we have put tons of time and energy into. So it's amazing to me when I talk to pastors and they say, man, our giving is just plummeting. My first question is, okay, so what options do people have to give online? And a very high percentage of people say, well, we haven't really done that. And I mean, you have to do that. And and I've heard online giving pretty simple. I've heard a lot of people talk about how text to give, even over years now, is something that when churches implement that, they've seen the kind of the summer dip go away, just because it, again, is so easy. I don't have to have my computer out or go to a website. I can just text a number. So there's a whole bunch of really simple ways, and I'm not going to recommend any platforms because there's dozens of those out there. But I think that's huge. And the last one, we signed up for the CARES Act, the payroll protection thing, and got that. For me, my biggest concern wasn't weathering this storm. My biggest concern really was taking the small cushion that we'd worked really hard to build and burning through that over these months, so that we were back to week. And so if we had, one low giving week, all of a sudden we're deciding, do we pay the mortgage or do we pay payroll? And I really didn't want to do that. So we were really thankful for that opportunity as well.
Well, thank you. So let's stay in your state and go a little bit north. And Pastor Derek, let's unpack this little bit more about talking about the PPP loan. When you're working through with your elders and leaders, how have you talked that through with them?
Thanks, Bruce. I want to make sure that the PA people know that this is a very different state than those Ohio folks. So, but we're in Pennsylvania, and so
that's right. Sorry about that.
That's all right. I just would never want to make that mistake. So yeah, with the PPP loan, and I would never assume that I would tell somebody what to do on this, but we've been working through it with our leaders, and I know there's some different angles at this, and let me just kind of lay out some issues on both sides of it, and without kind of telling people where to land. But kind of on the positive side of it in terms of receiving this money. I think this wouldn't be the first time in history where God has used a government to bless and ultimately, in their case, save his people. I mean, the nation of Israel was saved because of, if you will, a generous bailout from the Egyptian Pharaoh under Joseph's direction in protecting them during 7 years of famine. And so this isn't unprecedented. And so I think people who are thinking, well, should the government be intervening and this sort of thing, this isn't a new thing completely. And so as we walked our leaders through that, our elders through that, I think it was helpful to think about it that way. I think that, one of the other things is just that we really have no idea the impact that COVID is going to have long term. And, as I presented it to our leaders, we are very much a kind of a downstream organization. In other words, we're dependent upon the economy and people's jobs and other people working and that staying stable so that contributions can also remain stable. And so when the whole system destabilizes, it affects us downstream. And so we haven't really felt the effects of all of that yet as unemployment is continuing to grow, as businesses are continuing to shut down, and we're not exactly sure when that curve is going to come back up. And so I think just thinking in terms of, we may have met our budget for these last 2 months that we've been going through this, but we are not sure what the future holds, not necessarily because of our folks and their faithfulness in giving, but because of what's actually going to happen to the bigger economy. And so I think the government's taking a step to kind of, with both organizations and individuals, to say there's a new playing field coming, and we want to try to make sure that that there's an equitable distribution kind of in this new playing field. And so, I think that's kind of on the positive side of receiving it, of just saying that, the times would warrant it. I would say one thing kind of on the negative side, and obviously there's ideas about how much the government would be involved, and I think there have been very good lawyers and attorneys working on that are assuring that it's not gonna, the government is not gonna be taking over the church in these cases. But the one thing I think that is very important for churches to think about is just public opinion. And that's something that you're going to have to work through in your own area about what the overall idea is. And I know word got out in our area the other night. We still haven't decided what we're doing with this, but word got out the other night that one of the churches in town had received these funds, and there was a massive backlash of small business leaders who didn't get the loan, and people saying, well, these guys don't pay taxes anyway, how are they getting all this money, and that sort of thing. And so I think churches have to weigh out, assume that the word is going to get out to your community that you've received these funds, and then kind of go from there and decide, are we willing to to take that backlash that may come from some who don't think it's right for churches to get this money. So that's how we've been kind of working through it with our leaders.
Wonderful. Hey, good word from Pennsylvania. Thank you very much. Hey, that is some good words there. I appreciate that. Hey, so here in a minute, you're going to see a poll. You can do that on your own. So when you see that pop up, be sure to contribute to the poll. Also, we've gotten a couple of questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much for those questions. If you wrote a question in the chat function, please copy and paste it and put it in the Q&A. That's where we'll be looking for our questions. So now let me go back to Pastor Charles. Pastor Charles, you and I have become good friends, and we've talked a lot about this topic. So thank you for giving me permission to ask you about it. With the disparity of people of color, you made some reference to this. I want you to dive a little deeper into this. With the people of color and poor dying from the COVID-19, this becomes a very different conversation in your context, and really should influence the conversation of all churches as we're thinking about this. But it's especially true in the urban areas. How would you plan, and when would you feel comfortable in the reopening with that context in mind?
Wow, this is a very, very tough situation, right? And I think for any church, and particularly any hotspot area, but we see it all across the country, particularly African Americans, people of color, Asians, Latino, are really dying at a much greater rate. It's a huge concern. I mean, we've seen some denominations just get affected by it hugely. The Kojic denomination lost I think like 17 pastors. It has hit their that denomination really huge. So for us, and for me as a pastor, and I think all of us in urban areas or wherever there's hot spots where we see, DC, 80% of the folks who died 80% of the deaths in DC were African American people. I mean, that's crazy. Obviously, there's different reasons for that. And so as we kind of look at this, we realize that underlying health issues are one. We also know that healthcare is one. We know that there are people of color who don't have the same health conditions and or health care protections. And so when they go to the hospitals, they send them back home because they don't have the right coverage. And a lot of those guys end up going home and then they're dying because they don't want to go back or whatever the case may be. So we're really trying to do what we can to protect this community. So therefore, for us, as we look at how we're going to navigate it, anybody who's navigating where there is this kind of impact, we have to be very careful. We're going to err more on the side of safety before we open up anything. We're going to really use practical wisdom. As Ed Stetzer said, every community is going to look different. Every region is going to look different. Communities are going to look different. But as far as this community, we got to really encourage everyone to really step back. While we may be planning, we're not going to make any definite decision like in 2 months we're going to open or 3 months we're going to open. We're going to plan, but we're only going to open when we feel comfortable that our people are going to be protected. Because the last thing that I want, or any pastor wants, as well as you all know, you don't want to be labeled as a church who opened up and then the COVID-19 spread it and then it created a greater impact. Because keep in mind, and a lot of people of color, they go back home, they can't self-quarantine. When they say go home and self-quarantine, how are they going to self-quarantine? Many of them are living in apartment buildings or living where there's 5 or 6 people and more people. They can't self-quarantine. They can't go to a basement. They can't even go to an extra room. So it's going to spread. And so we don't want to be that. So what we want to do is really take our time. We're going to listen very closely to the local government. We want to communicate. I think one of the biggest things that we want to do is help educate our people even more, give them more resources, over-communicate with them, things that we're hearing, making sure that also there's not confusion, because that's part of it, right? You got people who are hearing certain things from certain media platforms, from political platforms, what they're hearing on social media. You got people say, I'm not taking the vaccine. We got people say, we are, it's cool. We got people say, who's going to be the first guinea pigs who are going to take it? So we got to make sure that we have what I call authoritative counsel, whether it's doctors or people who are smart that know what they're talking about, that our congregation can feel good about it. Because again, this is a very alarming disparity, and there's a lot to this. And so I think for us, we just want to make sure that we're going to make everything we can do to make sure that we're safe, our people are safe. And I know that's what everybody wants. And I'm not rushing. I don't want any pastor to rush, to feel like we have to do this. Now, I know we're trying to judge between economy and life. Lives are so important. And we do know that at some point things will change. Now, in the DC area, of course, it's a more government-based city, an area. So a lot of people are government workers. So the economies are not as affected. We know in rural areas where there's a lot of blue-collar workers, they're getting hurt hard. So we have to be sensitive why people are protesting on both ends, right? So we just have to really keep a balance. And I think the big thing here, Bruce, and to all of us, is everyone has to look at their situation and really do all they can to be safe and make sure that people are protected. And particularly in our context, being an urban, predominantly African-American church, we're going to be extremely, extremely, very, very cautious, not in fear, but in respect of what this thing can do, so that we can make sure that we could continue to move on. And we do have to maximize, like our elderly. We know they're going to be the last one to come. People underlying these issues, they're going to be the last ones to come back to church. We're looking at how do we help. Again, I heard this about children. Children's ministry. We know initially we're not going to be able to do children's ministry because kids can't social distance. I don't know if you guys heard now that they've just come out with this new thing that kids are getting from COVID-19 that is now being discovered, called multiple systems inflammation syndrome, which is now a new effect from COVID-19 that kids are getting. So we want to make sure we're doing everything to protect the folks. I think even one thing that we may be even thinking about is having a COVID-19 testing on our site in our parking lot on off days outside the church to let people know we're caring. We want to bring us even closer to the community so you can get tested and then look at all the other resources. So we're going to try to provide to our people as much resources as they can, education, making sure that they respond, get to the hospital quick. Don't let them send you home if you don't feel comfortable. And we have to make sure we fight for our people to make sure that they are safe and that we're getting the resources to them. So we want to over communicate before we get to that point.
I'm going to jump in for just a second. Charles, that's a great word. I appreciate that. The poll was up, and you've got like 10 seconds to finish if you haven't already. And if so, while you're doing that, I'm going to show you the results of the poll as soon as that's done. Just want to let you know that there have been some questions about links and things, or what resources. At the end of the week, we're going to try to compile any links that were shared on the chats, anything, and send those out to everyone who attended, so that everyone has a chance to do that. So as soon as the results are tabulated on the poll, we'll just post that, and we can see what's going on. Bruce, back to you.
Okay, well, let's go back to Executive Director Emily. So you gave us a lot of good, rich detail about some of the things that you're doing and some of the things you're having to think through. I want to ask you now, what important questions as a staff of Restoration, your church, you're thinking through when it comes to anticipating a reopening in the future?
Yeah, I think number one question right now is that we've been working on a reopening phased plan. I know that people have been asking, are you going to reopen? Are you going to wait to reopen until everything can be functioning? Or are you phasing? And we would definitely be in the phased category, phased opening. We're in a red county in the red part of Pennsylvania, with a lot of different opinions about whether we should open or not. So we would definitely be in the phases. But the question that I think is number one for us is, does our plan, as we're creating it, allow for us to dial up and dial down church activities as COVID-19 infection in the community waxes and wanes? Because this is not going away. And I like how Pastor Dan Knoll was talking about temporary versus transitional. This is transitional. So trying to create a plan that dials up ministry and can dial it back down quickly as needed. Another big question is, how do we continue to disciple kids and families when kids ministry is one of the last things that will be safe to resume? We have more people asking questions about that in our chat too. I think in person, as we consider the in-person gathering, it's what steps do we need to take to limit concerns before gathering? And a lot of this has to do with communication. I heard Pastor Charles say over communicate. I can't agree more. I'm often in the communication role at Restoration. So, limiting the concerns before gathering has a lot to do with our communication. And then what steps will we need to take to limit concerns while gathered? They're really two different questions to be considering as staff. And then how will we communicate the plan well? We're talking about a graphic. A lot of you have seen the charts. We're trying to make a chart that's really clear, but then also maybe adding a video element where we share more of our heart behind it. So it's not just a cold chart, but this is how we're caring for our community and how we're choosing to love God and love our neighbors by protecting ourselves and our neighbors from the spread of the virus. So those are some of the big questions that we're looking at as we anticipate phased reopening.
Thank you very much, Emily. So Pastor Nate, I want to change the conversation a little bit. So we've been talking a lot about details. So like, what do we need to do? What are some actions we need to take and everything? Let's look now more at a 30,000 foot level. How has the experience of dealing with COVID and limitations on the corporate settings impacted your planning and mission as a church?
It absolutely has in several ways. So in the intermediate, remembering I started with methods versus mission, we had to realize the things that had kind of been overlooked because of proximity. So how do we connect with people? When we're coming together, you can see someone, checking on them because you see them. But what are your metrics or what are your methods for reaching out to your congregational members to check in on them and see what their needs may or may not be? And do they know that they can reach out to you? And during this experience, there are a number of things that we've have been altered. I started earlier with our budgets. Where do we focus our resources? Are we bolstering our technology right now? Are we considering our staffing needs in light of what I'll call the out-room experience? Many of our structures were defined and our organizational staffing plans were designed based on bringing people together, needing people in the facility. But now we need people with the expertise to help us go and touch people when they're not in the facility. And what does that look like? What is our focus as it relates to mental health? Because we've had the physical impact, but we're going to see and are starting to see the mental impacts in families, in schools, and our churches are made up of families. So what have we learned there, and how do we meet those needs? How do we connect when we're not in the building, when we're limited in our gatherings and we're limited in our spaces? Our training, discipleship can't end this way. And the reason is we have no biblical model to stop discipling. Half of our New Testament was written by letters when one of the people who wrote most of it was in a prison. So if he can write and disciple from a prison, then we should be able to communicate when in real time we have the capabilities, or we need to be looking at how to bolster them. Those connections are huge. Some of the things that I know we've been doing right now is taking on the mantle of trying to care and show that we are the church, or what I'll call the well at the center of the city. When I think about Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well was on the outskirts. And if the well is out there long enough, people may forget it's there and what its value is. But if we become a resource at the center, meaning we are here, we've given masks out to the nursing homes, dialysis centers, police, fire. We've tried to provide meals where necessary and put in place things that we can reach out to our community. We prayer calls via Zoom to leave a platform for people to connect. Mental health check-ins via Zoom. Those are some of the things that COVID has showed us, that when we're not physically together, we can spiritually be united, but we have to be very much intentional about it. Stewardship. How are we showing our congregation what we're doing with the resources that we're saying keep giving? What are you doing with it? Because when people come into the building, they can see some of the things. Stuff kind of flows out. Communication kind of happens by proxy. But when people are not entering the building and they're giving, and some of them may be experiencing economic hardship, we have to be very intentional to show them, here's what the ministry is doing. Here's how the gospel is going forth. Here's where we've connected. And yet we have to be very cognizant of not coming off as self-promoting. So the big word here is really intentional. COVID has showed us that we have to be intentional in ways that we didn't even realize we had to be before. And I'm finding out that there are a lot of things that I was just comfortable with when we were in the building. I didn't have to worry about whether we're pre-recording or live. I didn't have to worry about that. When I walked in the door, my praise team was ready to go. My AV team was ready to go. Well, now you're doing things with smaller groups or with more communication with larger groups, and it all has to come together. And these are things that we just have to consider. It also exposes what we weren't doing well. I think that's one of the things that we're in large part probably trying to avoid looking at. But COVID has given us a mirror to say, hey, this was happening, but you weren't intentional. You weren't doing this well. You weren't reaching out to your congregational members. They were going out the back door and you were realizing it weeks late. We got away with it for a season because as people were joining and people were leaving, you were looking at your numbers. But now you have to ask yourself, are you, from a pastoral perspective, are you pastoring people? Or are you preaching to seats? Have we gotten good at preaching, but not necessarily at pastoring and meeting the needs and taking care of our congregations? And I think that's what I'm hearing the heart is resurrecting. This is resurrecting that in us making sure that we're considering the safety of our members, even with the risk associated with concerns and backlash from different perspectives and ideology regarding COVID. When do we open? How do we open? Well, on this Zoom, everyone's in the same place I'm hearing is, what is in the best interest of our people? And how do we do that? Not rushed, but at the end of the day, can we answer and honestly say, we have done everything we could to expand the gospel and take care of our members without giving ourselves a time hack that says, if we don't do it here, we failed. So those are some of the things that I think just going through this experience have taught us, that we really need to, from time to time, my pastor, Pastor Jenkins, would say, whatever you don't evaluate, you're not really going to be able to improve. And this experience should have caused us to self-evaluate what works well, what was just working and we forgot that it was even happening, and the things that we really need to improve, even when we transition into our new norm.
Mm. Wow, I hope you guys are taking notes. I'm planning on rewatching the recording just so I can write down some of the notes. So this is good stuff. Thank you. Thank you for that word.
Bruce, on what he just said, I want to introduce the next poll that's going to flash up there for a little bit. The poll is about what is the biggest issue that you're facing. And so we'll throw that up there. You've got about 60 seconds to respond. So everybody click where you're at, and then the results will show. But in the meantime, we've still got, a few more minutes before we start attacking some of the questions that are coming in. So if you still have questions, don't forget to use the Q&A button. Back to you, Bruce.
All right. Hey, thank you, Jason. So, hey, Pastor Derek, this time has been a unifying time. Churches have come together, people have come together, and it has been a divisive time. No matter what decision you make as a pastor, there will be people who will disagree with you. Is the government interfering too much? Are they trying to take away our rights? Should we be responding one way with extreme caution and cans of Lysol, or the other way, let's give everybody a hug? How when you're reopening to people who think the government is trying to take away your religious freedoms and trying to wrestle through all that, how are you guys dealing with that?
Yeah, so this is a real issue, and I think obviously there are different viewpoints depending on where you are in the country, and different different kinds of groups of people that we're reaching out to and such. But there's a great, as we could have known going into this, our country is tremendously divided around political parties, and it's no surprise that even a global pandemic has fallen into two political camps. And so it's kind of a strange thing to navigate. And I got a message in my inbox the other day that said, that I should be responding like how Dietrich Bonhoeffer responded to Adolf Hitler, and that it's time for the church to stand up against this whole thing. And one of the things I think is important is just to ask clarifying questions back if you're going to engage anybody like that. This happened to be a person that was part of our church, and so I basically was just able to say, now who is Hitler in this scenario? Like in your scenario, who is Adolf Hitler, and how are we supposed to be? Is it our governor? Is it our county executive? Is it who are we talking about here that we need to stand up against? And yes, I mean, there are stories circulating. There are people who are using this to overreach. There are governors in certain states that are using this to overreach in their authority. But to assume that there's kind of a widespread conspiracy going on, heck, we can't even agree on half the little things that we're dealing with, let alone there be this kind of unified effort to undermine our country. One of the things that I've found, and I would encourage all pastors to do just a little bit of research in this area, to be helpful, is I've been taking people back to, I said, okay, if you want to go back to history, and if we want to map out, how do we respond in times like this? Let's not go to Hitler and Bonhoeffer. Let's go to the 1918 flu pandemic. Like, let's go to an actual parallel to what we're going through right now. And yes, there are bad actors that are going to try to use this in a variety of ways, but let's go back to what's actually going on, and do a little research on the 1918 flu pandemic. And when places tried to reopen too soon, there were actually troop movements going on at the time. And so there's the ability to see how when crowds gathered together, it affected those crowds. And, I heard somebody say recently that the three most dangerous places through this pandemic are nursing homes, cruise ships, and churches. And we just have to be mindful that we are one of those things in our society that gathers large groups of people together, which for this kind of thing is a terrible thing to happen. And so, as long as we can find out other ways to do discipleship, I appreciated Pastor Nate saying earlier, this discipleship thing hasn't gone away. In fact, I think it's a good time to challenge some of our ecclesiology a little bit and to say, what really has to happen for a disciple to be made? Well, we need the gospel. We still have that. We need the Holy Spirit. We still have him. We need community. We still have community. These things have not been stripped from us. And so if there's a way that we're supposed to challenge our ecclesiology, let's do that and press into discipleship. But the idea that we're going to meet no matter what, I think is actually a wrong-headed view of the church, to be honest with you. And so part of the corrective measure, I think, is to take people back to what is the church, what is true discipleship, and we can do that till kingdom come, without meeting in a building ever again. And so, I think redirecting people that way toward history, toward the 1918 pandemic, toward what true discipleship and what the church actually is, has been a helpful conversation.
Hey, thank you, Pastor Derek. So with that in mind, I'd like to go to Pastor Rob. It's very easy at a time like this to get in victim mode. How all the negative and the bad that's happening, how sad it is for us. But the Bible tells us that all things can work together for the good. So what is one way you have seen God bringing good from this pandemic in your context?
Yeah, that's so good. And just an opening statement to that, I really appreciate the tone of everybody on the panel and how we're sharing. I think that's, part of our jobs in all of our contexts, right? We have voices on every side of this, pushing us every direction. And in my state, there was one day the governor gave an order, the next day it changed, and the day after it changed again. And some people, use things like that to say, oh, he's doing a terrible job. Actually, I think he's done a pretty good job. It just speaks to how difficult it is to navigate such a changing context. And so for us not to be hasty, and to really be measured and faith-filled in our responses is important. Bruce, it's already really been said, so I'll say it fairly briefly, but I think one of the things that is just incredible is all of us are learning how to communicate to a much bigger audience than just the people who are sitting in the room. And actually, Derek, the thing that you shared that was sent out to all the Converge MidAtlantic churches, because you've been doing this recording earlier in the week for years, was incredibly helpful and challenging. It's my people celebrate maybe a little bit that I'm actually preaching 30-minute or less messages now, which is like a miracle of Jesus. But just figuring out again how to be effective in a new season. We have people tuning in from different states and different countries. Christianity Today said this very clearly, that even though Easter wasn't really, this wasn't an in-person Easter, and Easter's always like one of our two biggest Sundays of the year by hundreds of people, we likely had more people tune in for Easter than have ever tuned in for Easter, have ever shown up for Easter. And so, as a church of about, 300 to 400 people on a typical weekend that has, anywhere from 700 to 1,000 on Christmas and Easter, for us to have 1,000 to 1,500 views every week digitally is just an incredible thing. And I'll just give one really quick story. So there's a restaurant that's become my favorite restaurant, and my favorite server at this restaurant, we've developed a little bit of a relationship, and he's kind of been talking about maybe coming to church. Well, he tuned in on Easter, and not only did that help him reconnect with the church, but he's also been sharing it with other family members who have connected, and is excited when we get back to in-person gatherings of coming. And that may have never happened in that way had we not been forced to do church in a different way, and really, again, gain the ability to reach a whole different group of people.
Yeah, great example. And we are getting into living rooms that we never would have gotten into before. So it's amazing how God is using this time. So I had Pastor Nold be the opener, and he's also going to be the closer. So we have one last question before we go to Q&A. So as a reminder, you do have that Q&A button. Feel free to throw in some questions there as after Pastor Nold finishes, Jason will pick up the Q&A time. So, Pastor, what has God been teaching you during this time that might be a lesson for later?
Yeah, I think there's a number of them. Some of them have actually turned into those guiding principles that I mentioned earlier, just about Derek used the idea of changing our ecclesiology. I'm thinking a lot about that, but I would say personally, my most significant lessons came at the beginning of this, and have kind of followed through, and it actually came in the midst of being sick, being tested COVID-19. I had symptoms for a week, and then in the middle of the week is when I found out for sure that I was positive, and that was 2 weeks into our change, no gatherings, and I had just a week before that been at a meeting with a bunch of pastors in Pennsylvania, large multi-site churches kind of thing. And we were talking about all of this and kind of keeping connected a little bit. And I'll be honest, I went to bed that evening after finding COVID positive, and I was kind of discouraged. And I was sick. I'm trying to lead through something that we never talked about in seminary. And I'm honestly feeling like I'm not doing that great a job, and a number of other pastors are kind of hitting it out of the park, and so I was doing a little bit of the why me whine kind of thing, and it's one of those places where I just had that sense of God saying to me, Dan, your problem is you're still trying to control everything that you can control, and you think it's all based on your leadership capacities. And I just had a clear sense of him saying to me, what you've been longing for, what you've been praying for, I'm doing. And you need to let go and be still, and that has carried me all the way through these 8 or 9 weeks, and I mean, I still have to go back to that. What am I trying to control that God's saying this is mine, and where do I need to be still, and so that's been part of it. The whole issue of control, the whole issue of what do I bring to the table? Is the most important thing that I bring my capacities and abilities as a leader, or is it my desperate dependency on God? And I'll be honest, I don't think that we're desperate enough yet. I'm not saying that things have to get worse before we get more desperate, because there's a lot of things to be desperate about. I just don't think that we're desperate enough yet. The second lesson, was kind of similar, and it came in the midst of a morning, sitting out and praying on our front porch. We kind of look out over the valley, and there's been a lot of emotion for me the last few weeks. It come at kind of the oddest of times sometimes, but this intensity that just kind of grips my heart and squeezes the tears out of my eyes, and if I'm alone, there's sobs, and at some point just asking God, what in the world is all of this? Because I didn't feel like it was fear or discouragement even so much. And at some point, again, I just felt like he was saying, this isn't your heart, this is my heart, and I'm just giving you a small taste of my love for my kids and my love for the world. And every time I pray, I just have this picture of Father's arms open wide, like he's put us on a worldwide Sabbath, and he's cleared out at least some of the distractions, and he's saying, come home. It's time to come home. It's time to quit playing with stuff that doesn't matter. And so those two things, give up control, surrender control, and the Father is for you. Those have been the lessons that kind of are carrying me through in this time. They're not lessons about how to do ministry. They're lessons about God, and lessons about what's going on in my heart. But for me, those have been some of the most important ones.
Thank you, Dan. I've heard you and Derek chat at one point online, and I heard a lot, and that was, I loved it, and it was so encouraging to me. So I appreciate all of you sharing. I'm going to dive into the Q&A and just post some things. I'm going to ask Ryan, our Converge behind the scenes guy who's making all the hamster wheels turn, to post the last poll as well as we start the Q&A time. The very first question that I'm going to address, and I'm going to ask Rob Patterson to address this. He and I have talked about this before, and so I think you might have some insight. It comes from Story Church, and we were friends there. But he asked, how do we navigate the tension of paid staff or leaders who are reluctant to gather in any form, and when we start this transition? In other words, if we start moving forward and specific staff or leaders don't feel comfortable, how do you navigate that tension and that conflict there?
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question. And I certainly don't feel like I have the definitive answer. But again, I don't know that, I think anyone in this time that talks like they have definitive answers, it's somewhat foolish. So if I had team members, and I don't, and I have a unique context where I live in a rural area where we have, pretty low instance of cases around me, which again, in some ways makes things easier and in some ways makes things more challenging. But what I would say is, if I had people that were reluctant, on the one hand, I would want to be asking, are we doing things that are foolish or unwise? Are we trying to move too quickly in a direction? Are we compromising people's safety? I'd really want to wrestle with that. And then at the same time, I would, hopefully in as balanced a way as possible, hey, if this person's on the team and we're not doing that, do they have, a realistic kind of perspective themselves?
I don't know, it's a little awkward to ask if any of the other panelists have a quick word on that, or if have they experienced that. But I'm just wondering, Derek, I saw you unmute your mic, so I'm going to point to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that this has revealed is there's a couple different personality types among people. I think generally in our congregation and certainly on our teams, and there are people that I've seen who have been energized by this, that it's like, oh man, let's go get it. We can innovate. We can do all kinds of new things. And there have been people who've kind of curled up and said, I want to keep my family safe. And they went into kind of Papa or Mama Bear mode with their families. And so, I think that one of the things that we've been trying to do is really run with the people who are energized and really be incredibly gracious with the people who are a little bit more in that protective mode. And I would just say, I think that that graciousness needs to extend to, man, if we're going to do live meetings, but there are still some people that are really concerned, let's make sure that we're folding them in digitally, just like we have been, and really not try to push too hard on that, because there are positives to both of those personality types. And I think we just need to be really gracious and accommodating to those right now, who are a little bit more in that protective mode. That's all I would say. It's not a definitive thing, but I do think those two personality types exist, and we need to respond to them in our church and on our teams.
That's good stuff. Thank you, Derek. I appreciate you hopping in there. Another question comes from Mark Henman, and I'm going to start with Emily on this one. The question he asked is, are you going to ease back in or wait until you can have everyone back together before you have your first in-person gathering?
Yeah, I kind of referenced this before, but we are definitely an ease back in. And we have been watching different churches, large churches from other states that are reopening, and watching what their communication has been like, what their planning has been like, and then modeling, receiving that, looking at that, modeling our plan off of that, making adjustments. But we will definitely be phasing back in based on the area of the country that we're in the hot spot that we are between New York and Philly here. So.
Great. You're in kind of a place, Mr. Nold, would you chime in?
Sure. I just, and this may change, like a lot of stuff that's changing. I think one of my, kind of sub-guiding principles on this issue is I don't want to try to gather people in a building on Sunday morning or the weekend, whenever you do it, until that experience can be better than what they're getting at home. So, in one of our rural sites, they're not getting internet very well, so there's something there that we need to deal with. But on the other hand, if we're going to follow our state's guidelines and social distancing and wearing masks and, 25 right now only, gathering and who knows what comes next before the green phase. I can't imagine it being a great experience, 25 people in a room that holds 500, everybody with a mask on. Have you tried to sing with a mask? You know what that sounds like? And if you don't have a mask, it's not just the gathering of people on Sunday, it's the singing that is, probably the best way of spreading a virus that there is in the world. And then you add into it, and this, Derek, is the place where I first heard this and started thinking about it, but I can't stop. You add into it the political divides that are going to cause someone to come to church and say, I'm not wearing a mask. I don't know. You can't tell me to wear a mask. And somebody else saying, you don't care if I live or die. And at a minimum, you're going to start having thoughts in the worship service like you have in the grocery store when you're walking down the aisle and somebody's going the wrong way and you're thinking, you idiot, what are you doing? And how do you worship God when in the next, phrase you're talking about the idiot who came over and shook your hands? And at worst, it's going to lead to pushing people away. So anyway, I don't want to, I'm not worried about bringing people together until I have at least a reasonable sense that it's going to be better than what they can get at home.
Rob, why don't you speak up? And I know Derek and Charles both also are talking. Rob first, then Derek.
Yeah, so for us, it's really simple. We were evaluating two things. One is, as things start to open back up here in Ohio, which is happening even this week, we're watching if things remain flat or they spike or they decrease. Like when it seems like people are doing normal things without increased cases and sickness, that will be kind of a significant indicator. And then, like Dan said, I don't want to say, hey, after the first 50 people come, we're going to close and lock the doors and then, just create a million opportunities. So the next 50 and the next 50. And we know you got ready and dressed and came, but that just seems really, really awkward. So we want to be able to let people who want to come. And we want to make sure that we're not exposing them needlessly to virus.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think that there's a nostalgia. I think their good vibes that are going on in their head, what they're imagining, is not at all what it's going to be like. And I'm going with back to what Dan said. Until that experience can at least be as good as, if not better than, what they're getting online. Because here's the deal: people will push and push and push, but I think when it actually happens, we've thought through it. When it actually happens, my wife has her favorite grocery store that she goes to. She can't go to it anymore because it had almost a romantic idea in her mind of what it was like to go grocery shopping at that store. And she's like, when I go in there, it's horrifying to see it different. And I think people are going to come back to church once for the nostalgia. They're going to sit here and go, this is awful. I'm not going to do this again. And they're certainly not going to invite friends. So when you get at kind of the core stuff that we're about, we just need to be very careful not to make decisions out of nostalgia, but out of actual what's actually going to work.
I just want to ditto Dan. I thought that was a great comment. And Derek said the same thing. We really want the experience to be a great experience for people, and I do agree with that totally. We even thought about, hey, why don't we do like the old days? Remember the gas rationing back in the 70s? People with odd numbers came on this day, even people with certain numbers on this day. We even kind of thought through all of that. But I agree. I think you really want to make the experience a great experience for people. And I think it may be a hybrid at some point too, right? Because you're going to have your online church, as some people said, and you still got to make sure you're ministering to both, people come live and the people online, and that they feel, because, you're going to have your elderly, you're going to have your people with underlying issues. That you're going to probably say, hey, stay home, but we want you to still have a powerful experience. If we do have people on site, we want it to be powerful as well. I do think the deal here is the church has to be the church beyond just the building, right? I think that's the key, right? We just have to be the church. And like someone said, we have to be a church not just with small groups, but a church of small groups, right? That we know how to minister to people in a very personal way. I've told people this is our greatest hour, that we can really be the church and personally, let's see how well we can personally disciple people now versus waiting for the corporate gathering to be the main source of discipleship. Can you as a leader disciple the folks that you oversee? Because we use the sheep shepherd kind of leadership concept. So our challenge is, let's see how well we do that. I said, please, when this all ends, I do not want to hear from someone in the congregation said, I never heard from anybody in my shepherd leader. They left me all by myself. I said, if I hear that, it's not going to be a pretty day. So, but the key is just really being the church, and we can be the church, whether it's a small group, a large group. I think I do agree with Dan. It should be a great experience, and how we shape that could be different for every location. But I do agree with that.
I'm going to jump in here because we're almost at the end of the time, and I want to hit a couple more quick questions. Quick is probably a relative term. In saying that too, there's been some questions asked about children's ministry resources that I know we've posted some things in the comments that I hope are helpful. It looks like from the polls that may be something we're going to have to do an entire webinar on, just to hand out resources and to go through stuff, because it's a big question and it's a good one. The question I want to ask, and it really ties into what you were just saying, Charles, how are you guys discipling people right now? I mean, not when we get back together, but right now. And the follow-up to that, or maybe the precursor to that is, how do we talk about baptism in the context of not being able to gather and make a public statement? So Nathaniel, I will start with you.
I was waiting for that question. I happen to benefit because the church that I became the pastor of actually operated in small groups. So the small groups just simply went over to the Zoom, and they continued to use Zoom. So that extension that Charles is talking about, Pastor Whitaker is talking about, is, hey, these small groups allow discipleship. I think one of the things that us as pastors have to remember is that it's not all on us. I think that's what Dan was pointing to as well. We can overinflate our own presence to the point that if I don't do it, it's not happening. And the reality is, if we are really discipling people, then at some point the discipleship process evolves and they're discipling people. So when you have small groups in these communities and they're discipling, you can model and look through that, and you can connect with the leaders and add that. We can do a lot of this through technology. Yes, we can lock it down, but there's ways to do that. Then with those that are close to you, you need to be reaching out and having that intentional conversation, because it is the community aspect that really we're being challenged by. It's the ability to be accountable to one another as we're discipling. And that takes some intentionalness. That baptism is really what got my attention, because I have facilitated baptism for someone during COVID, and while we haven't been together corporately in the building. And the reason is, it's something I didn't grow up with, but when I saw it, this model at my church, I kept it and fell in love with it. And that was a part of discipleship includes baptism. And in many places, we've taken the baptismal part out of the person who was discipled and put it in the hands of just the pastor. So what I did for one of our teens who wanted to be baptized, he was adamant he wanted to be baptized. Easter Sunday was coming. And what we did was, I had his father get in the baptismal with him, someone who was living in the home with him. And literally, I stood off in the distance. We played with the camera so it looks like I'm closer than I am. And literally, I asked the question, have you decided to follow Jesus? He answered the questions. You could hear it on the camera. And his father baptized him. You can baptize people in a bathtub. And I think what's happened is we've gotten to it has to be huge and dramatic, and it has to be the pastor. Well, I think we're seeing the reverse of that now for things like that. We're going to have to go to a place of saying, if I fully disciple you, then Matthew 28 comes into mind, that you're going to teach what you've been taught and baptize. And if we want to facilitate that, we can, but it's going to take some of us, I'm playing on Pastor Noel's words, releasing things back to God to facilitate through other disciples that you should have been making, and they are now making disciples. I've heard of conversations about pushing it off, and I'm not going to condemn someone who says we'll do it later. However, what I will say is, I ask you to ask yourself the question, are you pushing it off because you have to be the one? Or are you pushing it off because there is no way to do it? And it's really rhetorical because I don't believe there's no way to do it. I think it challenges us to think outside of our methods and get back to mission. So that's what I wanted to kind of add there. I don't know how that plays everywhere. However, it's just a thought that we need to really consider. Is our issue with baptism our method, or is it that we need to reconfigure our views to our mission?
Derek, you want to chime in? We've got about 4 minutes left.
Yeah, just real quick on that. I think we also have to really think about, especially if we're going to be in the digital world with our weekend services for a little bit longer, to really think about that experience. Take it from the auditorium to the living room and say, how do we get people to engage in conversation maybe during our services? How do we engage people with music? I don't think they're sitting there singing necessarily but could we set up the songs in a way that would say, hey, when this line comes, think about it, or pray through it, or put your hands on your lap like this, or make the experience a little bit more engaging and relational, that we're doing on the weekend too, I think will help us to rethink it.
That's good stuff. That's good to think about too. There's a few questions here, and I can't really get into all of them in specifics. One of them, and this is something where other people, maybe you can get some ideas, brainstorm with other leaders around you, but they're asking about ministering to those in a nursing home. And I think that's a practical question that I think every single city is going to have a different answer to. So I don't want to try to dive into that too deeply. Also, a good question Gary Mariano brought up, and I think that's part of why we do this, is how do we protect against burnout for pastors? Over the last 2 weeks, I've spent time with a lot of pastors who are really tired. They're running and they're doing things that they don't, this isn't what they normally do. And so they're exhausted. And so I think we need to really think about that. We really need to build into that. Rob, you and I were talking about that last week a little bit in 30 seconds or so. Can you give a quick, some of the stuff you said last week?
Yeah, no, I think that it's crazy, isn't it? How a lot of the normal things we do, we're not doing. And yet we all feel like we have way more to do. And part of that's just figuring out things in a brand new way and doing things we've never done before. But I think just like we would tell our people, we need to make sure in a time like this, and really all the time, to make sure that we are connected to the source. Like Dan said, man, some of the things he's learned have been in the mornings, looking out over the valley, drinking a coffee and talking to Jesus. If we're not doing that kind of stuff all the time right now, I think we will be burned out fairly quickly.
Hey, well, one really interesting thing, just really quickly, if you know the name Kurt Thompson, he wrote the book, The Soul of Shame, and he has a blog post, and he had a really good blog post on one of the reasons why we feel so drained is because of all the Zoom calls, and in a Zoom call or whatever you're using, so much of communication is the nonverbals, and we see each other, so we think we should be getting nonverbals, but we're really not getting nonverbals. So it's kind of like having your plane or your phone on while you're on a plane, and it keeps searching for service, but it's not finding it, drains the battery even quicker. So, it's actually, I found at times when I can do it, it actually helps to kind of alternate Zoom with phone calls, because on a phone call, my brain ain't looking for nonverbals. That part of it shuts off. And on these, I keep trying to see how are people responding to what I'm saying. And so anyway, find the article. It was really helpful to me. Explain why I'm tired after a day of Zoom calls.
And we got 1 minute left. So make it quick if you've got something, and then we've got to wrap up.
Well, I was listening to Ed Stetzer say this the other day on the webinar, and he used 1 Kings 19:5-21. And just 4 real quick principles: rest and eat. Talk about the story of Elijah. Get perspective. Be real. Listen for and to God's voice, and find community. All of us as pastors need to continue to do that. One of my good friends, Elwood Jones, he got COVID, him and his wife at his house. And he said, be still and know God. God, some of the same things, Dan, that God revealed to you, revealed to him. So God bless. We have to get rest.
All right. Nate, in 15 seconds, can you give me something?
Let it go. And what I mean by let it go is we burn out when we try to do too much. We need to get to a place where we trust the leaders we have and disseminate some things out. Let some people take on, because I think it'll be beneficial for them as well, because others are looking for how they can engage, and we're hoarding it, saying, I got to get it done. We got to let it go, put it in God's hands, and then trust the people that we've discipled and our leaders to take some of the weight.
Yeah, I think that's important. The last question, and one mention that a question that came up is seeing maybe 4 or 5 churches that are near each other in proximity, kind of combining some resources and doing some things together as, things unfold, whether it's, ordering hand sanitizer, right, in mass. That might be, there are lots of examples of things to do, and I would encourage you to reach out to those people around you to do that. Last question, and is there a question that pastors should be asking that maybe they are not asking yet? Any of our panelists, can you think of something that we really ought to be thinking about? And you don't even have to answer the question. I really want you to leave the question out there so the attendees can start wrestling with it. Go ahead, Rob.
I think we're asking too many questions. I think we need to just listen more. We need to breathe more.
My question right now that I keep, hanging on is, what in the world is God doing? What in the world is God saying?
I heard a phrase recently that says, how do we reach the people that didn't know they needed a church until right now? And I think that there's the situation that we're in has created this vacuum. And I think people realizing that the things that they had staked their hopes on are not lasting. And there's a vacuum, and how do we help them to see that the answer is Jesus?
I think for me would be, how do we make sure that we are ministering to the mental health of everybody? Because so many people have lost loved ones, couldn't be with them, they died in transition without them. I think there's a lot of repercussions that how as we as pastors can figure out a way to help minister to people's mental health and marriages, because some people's marriages are really struggling because they're together and then they really see what they really didn't want to see, right? So I think both mental health and marriages.
Those are all great things. Dr. Hoppler, I'm going to turn it back over to you, but just before I do, I want to let you know, as a staff or Converge MidAtlantic, to all the pastors that are tuning in, we are here for you. I mean, we really want to be a resource, even if we don't know the answers. Obviously, we know people. I found 5 people here or 6 people here pretty easily that are willing to share resources and to share their knowledge and wisdom. Please give us a call. Let us know you have our contact info. You've registered. We are happy to do that. When it comes to the mental health things that you were just talking about, one thing that Dr. Hoppler has put together, and the MidAtlantic Conference is going to host a Compass event, which is you sign up as a pastor and you can be part of it. This will be in late October, assuming we're allowed to travel and all that stuff, but we're going to go ahead and put it on the books and start working towards that. There'll be more information coming, but something just to put on your radar. Brian Weber, the executive pastor here, and myself, and then Emily, who's on staff, and Jenny and Liz, we are here. Hey, Brian, we are here to serve you, and we really want to. So that's our heart for you. We are praying for you. And Dr. Hoppler, if you have anything you want to close out with, have at it.
What a blessing. I plan on re-listening to this. Thank you, and reach out to and have conversations, even your lead teams or wherever. And just remember this thought: get off the treadmill. This is no longer a sprint. It is time to think in terms of a marathon. And just like in an airplane, if it's starting to have problems in the oxygen mask, you take care of yourself first, so that you are positioned to take care of everyone else well. Work on your own spiritual formation and just slow down a little bit and know that God is in control, as many have already said. Thank you. So, Brian, I guess this closes this out.
Yeah. Thanks for coming.